how they're navigating their world, how they're experiencing all of this. So I guess it makes it a little bit easier to take a more empathetic approach.
The MMFC acknowledges that it carries out its work on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Peskotomuhkati peoples. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, and descendants of this land. We honor the knowledge keepers and seek their guidance as we strive to develop closer relationships with the Indigenous people in New Brunswick. Welcome to In Conversation, a podcast produced and hosted by the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research at the University of New Brunswick. Through this podcast, we hope to bring you insightful discussions with researchers, advocates, policymakers, and community members who are working to address the complex issues surrounding family and gender-based violence. The MMFC is a research center dedicated to advancing knowledge, fostering dialogue, and creating change through community-based participatory research. We provide an Atlantic Canadian perspective on research in the field of family violence and actively seek the participation of researchers from across the country and around the world. My name is Dr. Stefanie Hunt-Kennedy, and I'm the director of the MMFC. Today's episode features Dr. Brandon Sparks. Dr. Sparks holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Saskatchewan, where his dissertation looked at incels, dating apps, and social and mental well-being. He is currently a SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of New Brunswick St. John campus, where his postdoc project looks at trauma-informed police responses to intimate partner violence. Welcome to In Conversation, Brandon.
Thanks for having me.
So can you begin by just kind of telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this research?
Sure. So my background really revolves around this nexus of sort of healthy to unhealthy relationships, focusing earlier on healthy relationships and then kind of spanning that to the end of sort of sexual violence. And like a lot of people, I was hearing about incels in the news, and this was probably around late 2018, and I thought, what's the research say about this group? And when I searched it, there was nothing. So I thought, okay, why not?
Yeah.
Why not be one of the first people to better describe or understand what's going on with incels? And what I learned was that they have existed in some form or another. Well, obviously for probably the entirety of human existence, but there was a little bit of research on them done back in 2001. And after that, there's basically nothing. But what seems to have happened is they've morphed from a pretty benign group to obviously what we know today. And that all happened sort of in the early 2010s. Around the same time we started seeing dating apps increase in popularity.
Interesting.
And my thinking was, dating apps can be really great. They can be very efficient, but they also mean you could face a lot of rejection in a really short period of time, right? You can download the app, you can swipe right on a bunch of people, not match with potentially hundreds of people. And prior to dating apps, that really wouldn't happen unless you were to go out to a bar and ask every single person
Right.
out, which you're probably not going to do. Not a very good strategy. So it got me thinking, is it priming people to feel the rejection more strongly because they get hit all at once? It's sort of an unprecedented rate. Even if you're a relatively popular person, you're still going to get a lot of rejection, much more than you ever would. So
in the real world.
world. So that was kind of my jumping off point was, are these experiences, how do they relate to inceldom, or how do incels experience dating apps? Is it different from non-incel men?
Also because dating apps are so much of it is based on physical attraction, right? Which I think we'll get to when we talk about incels. But just to start, what is an incel?
So that's a great question, and it's something that no one has a really great definition for, and there's not always among incel researchers, among incels themselves, there's not an established definition. I tend to take a more liberal approach to it and say that it is a person who is experiencing a lot of difficulty establishing or maintaining a romantic or sexual relationship to the point where they experience some sort of duress and it comes to sort of form a part of their identity. So I don't attach any sort of ideology to it, although they certainly have developed sort of their own. But there's lots of individuals who are incels or are involuntary celibate who don't. So I draw the line there.
Okay, so incel, basically a portmanteau, right? Between involuntary and celibate.
Yes.
Right? You know, from a societal perspective, we often think of incels as, you know, these kind of angry, anti-feminist men. But just hearing you describe your own definition, it takes a more nuanced approach, and also it sounds like almost a more compassionate approach to your definition or to your understanding of incels. So can you tell us a little bit about what your research uncovered about incels, and maybe specifically incels and loneliness, that kind of brought you to understand them in perhaps a more nuanced way than what we hear on, you know, media coverage and stuff?
Yeah, so I was quite surprised when I launched, well, the first two studies really, and you hope, obviously, as a researcher, that your hypotheses are correct. And, you know, I had said, okay, I bet they probably have more depressive symptoms than non-incel men. And they did. But what really struck me was the magnitude of difference. Some of these were about 3 times the magnitude that you would see in general psychology. So we're talking about, they're not just a teeny tiny bit more depressed. It's a substantial amount. And when I ran study 2, which focused not just on mental health, but also, I guess, called social health, right? Loneliness, social supports. That was run during the pandemic when, as we know, a lot of people really struggled with connection. And yet that difference, that large magnitude, still existed between incel and non-incel men, even when that was sort of an elevated thing for everybody. So it really speaks to the magnitude of issues that they're facing. And I think, even though, again, a lot of them don't necessarily endorse violent attitudes or misogyny, I think it helps to understand how some of them might get there if they are already experiencing that degree of isolation and internalizing symptoms.
Right. So this kind of social exclusion that's claimed by incels, how much of that is a product or a reflection of like the wider kind of male loneliness epidemic? And maybe as like an add-on question, why are we seeing this rise in social isolation among young men, you know, over the last couple decades, I would say?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that incels are maybe a good example of the male loneliness epidemic. We often talk about the male loneliness epidemic as something with older men, right? The idea that once men generally get married or get into a long-term career, they stop making friends and they kind of rely on their partners to be their therapist and also their friend maker and all of that. But with incels, they're obviously not married. We obviously see this much younger. In my own and some colleagues' interviews with incels, this social exclusion, though, it goes back. They were bullied during adolescence, didn't have any or very few friends. So this idea of exclusion has really gone on, and I guess for them, gone undetected throughout adolescence. So by the time they're in their 20s and their 30s, it's nothing new. I think there's a few different reasons for it. I think one of them has just been, it's not been a focus of society. We recognize it as an issue. There's been a lot of other gender-based issues we've spent time addressing, generally related to women's rights. And I think that's partially why we see some of the manosphere influencers coming up, because they're catering to a group that generally aren't catered to in that sort of direct, affirmative way. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're kind of seeing this really weird shift. And yeah, I guess just the way that we're talking about this. I think another issue is that traditionally there haven't been a lot of great men's social groups. When men tend to get together and socialize, it might be surrounding sports, right? You're part of a sports team, and there's lots of stuff even on, professional athletes. Once they retire, they really struggle because they're like, well, sports is my identity. That's the only real means I had of talking to other men and hanging out with other men. What do I do now that that's gone? Obviously, not everyone plays professional sports, and everybody gets older and will at some point reach a point when they can't play sports. Now, you look at someone like incels who, I think by their own admission, are generally not jocks. So they've never had that opportunity, and lots of other people haven't had that opportunity. Sports is getting more difficult to get into, right? It's more competitive. Things like hockey cost an astronomical amount of money, requires a lot of family commitment. So if they don't have these spaces to form friends, then we're gonna get to the point where we see now.
Do you think that like the increase in kind of online, even just like the way that young people spend their time, and specifically I think among boys, like the prevalence of gaming, right? Instead of like being out, I sound like such a millennial right now, but like instead of like being out on the streets until the streetlights come on, more and more younger boys and youth are spending their time online and, quote unquote, connecting with friends through gaming and these other kind of virtual spaces. Do you think that that is also kind of a contributing factor to this increase in loneliness and a lack of kind of male friendship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, for a lot of people and a lot of interactions, there's a limit on what an online friendship can offer.
Yeah.
And that's not to, poo-poo on them or anything like that, because they can serve a purpose, but it's also somewhat distinct, right? A lot of people do have sort of a bit of a separation between their online and offline self. And I saw some interesting research that has looked at, and it's something I want to maybe try to get into with incels, the difference between what they call bridging and bonding. And that's specifically used in response in relation to online relationships, especially online gaming. So the idea is that basically you can have a bridging connection, which is basically like a superficial friendship.
Yeah.
Where you might know who they are or something a little bit about them, and you might enjoy small talk or game related talk with them. But that's kind of the extent of it.
Right. You're not like sharing your deep and meaningful, thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with those relationships, but most people are going to need more substantive relationships in their life as well, not just those bridging ones. The bridging ones are fine. They're a supplement. They might be a great escape. But if that's all you've got, there is that lack of like emotional intimacy.
Yeah.
That a lot of incels have been open about in saying like that's really what they're after.
So, you mention more kind of superficial relationships and also the kind of high rates of rejection that incels at least, claim to experience. What can you tell us about how incels have coped with rejection? And maybe are there differences between how incels cope with these, fairly like universal human experiences of rejection? But how do they cope with them differently than, say, non-incel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I found is that they are already higher in rejection sensitivity. So they already have, and that's rejection sensitivity from anybody. So that's not necessarily or exclusive to the dating context. If a family member lets them down, if a friend is unavailable, they tend to respond more strongly to that. Does that predispose them toward inceldom? I don't know, but it's certainly something that at the very least seems to be out there.
So they have a higher sensitivity to rejection. And is this based on, as you were mentioning earlier, like a kind of a childhood experience that made, like experiences that made them high, you know what I mean? Like it's not, we're not talking about like biological determinism, right? So like, are these all kind of experiences that have shaped them to be more sensitive?
I suspect that that is the case. What we also see, and again, this is probably all, there's probably a lot of overlap here. Across multiple studies, they're scoring lower in secure attachment and higher in anxious and avoidant attachment. So basically what that tells us is they don't necessarily have a healthy model of relationships. They see them as either not maybe worth fully investing in because you're going to get hurt, or requiring a lot of reassurance in that relationship. And you can imagine if you've experienced a lot of bullying growing up and maybe you didn't feel a strong sense of warmth from one or both of your parents, and if you have really no other positive experiences, you're going to carry that onto you in adulthood. You are going to be a bit more sensitive to rejection. I guess alternatively, the response could be they could become not very responsive to it because they've sort of insulated themselves and they're just aloof and don't care.
Right.
But I don't think someone like that would become an incel because they wouldn't form an identity around it if they simply don't care about relationships. So,
and then how do incels cope with this, with their experiences of rejection?
So what we found is that relative to non-incel men, incels engage in fewer positive or healthy coping mechanisms, and they tend to engage in a lot more self-critical rumination and less positive reframing of whatever situation that they're in. What we did find, which was interesting, is that incels were more likely to engage in venting.
Okay.
Which is interesting because you also look and they're saying, well, I have no friends, I have no social supports, or a lot fewer than others. So it makes you wonder, okay, they must be venting on the forums, and their comments on the forums might reflect what they might say to someone in person if they had that opportunity, which, as we know, sometimes when we're venting, we say things that we don't necessarily always mean or fully capture our thoughts and feelings, right? It's just an emotional response or reaction. And if you're saying that to a friend, they understand that. And they're not necessarily going to go and challenge you on it. You just want to have someone say, yeah, that really sucks, man. Yeah. Dating's hard. Women or men or whoever can be so cruel or mean, blah, 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 blah. Of course, this also then impacts research on incel forums because they're picking up on these comments and they have no means of knowing, is this person just venting because they just started talking to someone and it went really far south, or is this an established belief that they have? Right? There's no way of knowing. So that's also something I think that people need to be cognizant of, is for a lot of individuals, this is their only means of venting. There's obviously a limit as to what I will say, like, okay, you can say that when you're venting. Some of the pretty harsh stuff that's on there, just not acceptable. Yeah. Regardless of how upset you are. But yeah, so just keeping that in mind when reviewing this kind of stuff.
Just like speaking to you, Brandon, you provide such a interesting perspective based on your training. You have a PhD in psychology. And even just in our conversation up to this point, I can sense, like, again, I say compassion. It's not to justify or excuse misogynistic ideologies or comments or actions of incels, but you are putting these people in their own kind of historical context and providing an explanation as to how someone can kind of get to this point, right, of kind of buying into these ideas, and also emphasizing like the importance of friendship and having support networks and a healthy childhood and, all of these different elements. So I hope I haven't already answered my own question, but I'm wondering, what do you think your training in psychology brings to this research, either to gender-based violence research in general, but even more specifically on inceldom?
Yeah, so I think the bulk of incel research is on incel forums, some sort of textual analysis or thematic analysis. And that's important because it does give you a context in which incel discussions are happening and an understanding of what they're exposed to, whether or not people post. At the very least, it tells you the messages that they might be exposed to if they were to go on the forums. And that's a great sociological approach. I'm more interested in sort of the individual elements of it. I don't disregard these contexts. They're very important, but I'm more curious in terms of what are they experiencing at an individual level? What can that tell us about the incel experience, how they're navigating their world, how they're experiencing all of this? So I guess it makes it a little bit easier to take a more empathetic approach. It's an approach that's gotten me a lot of criticism. I'm responding to a reviewer right now who is saying that acknowledging their experiences of bullying reifies harmful incel beliefs. And my colleagues and I have written a whole response paper on this saying, and I had to dive into like hermeneutics and all of these sort of philosophical concepts that I wish I'd never had to get into to sort of justify this and say, look, I can come at them from a compassionate, empathetic approach. I don't think acknowledging that, yes, you had a pretty rough upbringing or you experienced bullying, that doesn't justify, and I'm certainly not justifying, the development of antisocial thoughts or beliefs. In the same way, right, there's lots of documentaries out there about serial killers. I'm equating incels with serial killers, but there'll be lots about, they were abused as a kid. That helps us understand. That doesn't justify the behavior, but it certainly helps to humanize and make you understand how did someone get to this point.
Yeah.
This is effectively no different, right? Or terrorism research. You want to know why people are joining Al-Qaeda? Well, if you can't muster any empathy for that person and be willing to understand what sort of life circumstances led them there, then you're not going to get your answer.
Yeah.
And that's fine. There's lots of people who can come at it from a more critical angle. And if that's what you want to do, that's great. That's warranted too. But that can't be the only way that you approach any research topic because it's going to limit what kind of information you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we know that it's so important to not only study survivors' experiences, but also people who do harm, right? That is also a preventative approach to eliminating gender-based violence. And yet, as you've just pointed out, when it comes to incels, there seems to be this real reluctance to afford them that understanding or to even engage with them to better understand. I think in some ways it's like people just don't want to give them attention. I'm curious to know, like, why do you think folks, and I say this, I don't even mean researchers specifically, but even like on a societal level, why do we seem so unwilling to understand incels in the way that we might try to understand other people who do harm?
That's a great question. It's one I wish I had this beautiful answer to give you. I think there's a number of things that could help us understand that. And I'm kind of going back to my example of serial killers or something. There's something mysterious about that. There's something alluring. Some of them are very charming. Incels, sort of by definition, aren't.
Right.
They're not necessarily spectacular individuals. They're not a Ted Bundy or something like that. So they don't have that element. I think there is a lot of, there's forums called things like incel tears, right? Where they make fun of incels or things that people say that might be incelly. So I think there's a lot of, this incels predominantly are from, privileged groups. So too bad, In one of my studies with incels, they scored a little bit higher. It wasn't like the massive magnitude of some others on sexual entitlement, right? And there's lots of societal debate about men and sexual entitlement and all of that. And of course, we're really big on, Me Too and importance of consent and the right to say no. And it seems like they're coming at it, or they're positioned in a way that's really anti that. But I didn't focus when I wrote up the results. I didn't really focus too much on the sexual entitlement piece because I wasn't really thrilled with how it was operationalized. Because you could also take it from a very sex positivist view, right? Do you have the belief that you deserve to have sex when you want it? you could be coming at that from a very like patriarchal, like, yes, I can demand it, or like, no, I'm a human being and I absolutely deserve sexual freedom is very important, and ergo, I should be able to have it when I want it, obviously within confines and like a consenting partner and all that. So, but I think that kind of gets those things kind of get blurred, and there is obvious discussion on some forums about taking away women's rights and forcing them to be with one man. So I get why people would say, why would you want to extend an olive branch to those people? But in my own interviews, a lot of them have said, no, we think that women's empowerment is actually a good thing because it helps with the insecure attachment. Because they said, if a woman was with me, romantically, sexually, or whatever, I would know it's because she wanted to be and not because she was obligated to or dependent on me. So you're going, I did not think of that. Obviously, that's not the view of every incel, but you're going, that's interesting, and I wish that came up more often because that's actually a really interesting counterpoint to what we see on incel forums.
Did you interview anyone that used to identify as an incel and no longer does? And like what changed?
No, my colleague Alyssa Marin at University of Victoria has,
Okay.
and that's the only study that has looked at former incels.
You mentioned patriarchy in in one of your answers, and I think that's kind of the elephant in the room in this discussion. And just hearing you speak, it kind of reminds us that the patriarchy is not just an imposition on women; it's also an imposition on men and all everyone. Where do you see the patriarchy kind of showing up in kind of incel world? And I'm curious to know how you see it as harming these men in ways that they might not even recognize.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm thinking, I was literally just editing an incel paper right before this, and one of the big things was about kind of the contradictions within their black pill ideology, where in the one hand, they're viewing themselves as victims of social and power structures, patriarchy-esque. Um, but then they also reinforce those same things. So I think what's tough for incels is that they very much view, or they're in line with societal expectations of what it means to be a man. And they fully acknowledge that they do not meet those standards and they feel really bad about it. And they also think that that's what women want, even if women don't know it or say it, that is deep down what women want. They want the barbarian with the club that's going to, do all of these things and provide for them. And, it's obviously a bit reductionistic and inaccurate. But so then they beat themselves up over it because they're like, well, I can't do that. That's not me. And I've seen some concern about what would happen if incels were in a relationship. And they see social narratives about women wanting men to be more emotionally open, right? Discuss your feelings, da 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 da. Their worry is, and they've kind of said this, is that they feel that they're fairly emotional people, which again, not falling within this masculine paradigm, and that if they were to express that to a romantic partner, they would leave them because they would be seen as unmanly and going too far. So, it's sad to see. And you can see how that again feeds into this idea of attachment, right? Of not understanding that in a healthy relationship, you should be able to express those things and your partner would not leave you. Certainly some people are better partners than others and some might, right? And I think that is what helps them hold on to that belief is, well, yeah, if I were to date 100 women and I trauma bombed them, some of them would leave me. Yeah, absolutely, some of them would. Because that's human nature. People are different.
Yeah.
And you can't say that 100% would accept you. in the same way that not 100% of men are going to accept women, right? Like, so because there's a kernel of truth to some of their beliefs, or it can theoretically be true, it makes them hold on to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because there seems to be, like, they seem to kind of reject this kind of patriarchal kind of ideal, right, of a man by saying, well, I'm not that. But they, as you say, but they don't reject it and say, I'm going to be something different in the world of like a heterosexual relationship. It's like they reject it and then kind of completely close themselves off, again, with the kind of assumption that that is what women want, even though they sometimes recognize that maybe there's a bit of a diversity in what women want.
Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah.
And that's part of so originally they had this red pill ideology, right? It's a throwback to the Matrix. Neo is given an opportunity. Take the blue pill or the red pill. Blue pill, you can be blissfully unaware, you can be happy. Red pill, you're awoken to all of life's truth, and you're going to be kind of miserable because now you see everything for how it really is. So incels took the red pill, or so they say. And then they started to develop their own ideology called the black pill, which is basically more a nihilistic version. So instead of saying, okay, well, society's based on looks-based hierarchy, we're ugly, ergo we're doomed. But if we get plastic surgery, if we break bones in our face and try to get them to grow back stronger, get leg lengthening surgery, go to the gym, I can ascend and I can be desired by women. The black pill is like basically, no, you can't. You are lonely and you're doomed to loneliness forever. There's nothing you can do about it. So you may as well accept your fate. So, and that seems to be where more of those discussions are going. So again, it's really sad because they're promoting hopelessness and helplessness, which, there's been some that say that that's helpful because you can almost take like a stoic approach to it and say, well, it's out of my hands, rather than continuing to, in their view, like grasp at straws and, oh, I tried this, I saved up all my money, I went into a ton of debt and I got this surgery and I'm still not attracting women. Oh, well, now what else do I do? Or I'm spending all this time at the gym and it's not helping. What else am I doing wrong, right? So I can understand why sometimes saying there's nothing you can do, accept your fate, can be beneficial, but at the same time, it's not really true, right? It's not like a terminal diagnosis, although some of them would probably view it that way. But
So it seems like everyone's talking about Louis Theroux's new documentary, The Manosphere. Have you seen it?
yes,
Yeah. Thoughts?
I was really blown away by when Louis would go out with them in public, how many people recognized them, because man, I wouldn't know who the heck that is. And I don't know, it's also possible they like posted on socials like, hey, I'm going to this coffee shop, come by. Because it was quite surprising how many people recognized them, the ages, the degree to which they follow them and put themselves in maybe not the best place to succeed, or even things like following their financial advice. Like, even if you think they're giving you good relationship advice or life advice on women, that's very different, right? Like, I don't take financial advice from my mechanic. So why would I do this? It's eye-opening because I don't really engage with that part of the world or even that part of the research. And there are some incel researchers who know a bit more about it than I do, who say a lot of incels actually reject a lot of these manosphere stuff. Because if you're of the position that it's all hopeless, you see these guys as grifters, right? We know there's nothing you can do. So we know what you're selling. You're selling a product. You're selling yourself. You're doing this to get ahead. So how universal that is among incels, it's really tough to say. But probably of the manosphere groups, they're probably the most skeptical of some of these. But again, it's really, and this is where you need the sociology, it's really difficult to piece them all apart because it is kind of a melting pot in that sense, right? You can't isolate them from those things or those ideas. And to some extent, and this is true, I think, for some of those influencers and for incels in general, a lot of their views, they didn't come up with those on their own. They've always existed. They're just saying some of the underlying assumptions or beliefs that have percolated in society for a long time. They're just saying it out loud.
Like what? Like,
well, the idea that, like, I guess the black pill ideology that women want highly attractive men who are well resourced. The idea that women are after money was not something that, like, that existed before 2010, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's always been those beliefs that have been out there. So incels did not coin that, right? They're saying it a lot more loudly than a lot of other groups are. And they're saying it as like a universal thing. But again, they didn't come up with that. I don't think a lot of the male influencers, again, they're not necessarily new ideas. They're just putting their own kind of spin or flavor on it. But it's all the same kind
not,
of...
like, highly original.
No.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear you talk about the documentary and the men who are in that documentary in the manosphere, and then incels, and then, like, even when we think about, like, the kind of romanticization of these, like, very regressive gender roles in terms of, like, trad wives and other things that we're seeing, it's like all kind of like you say, they're separate, they're not the same, but they're all kind of like overlapping or all kind of part of this very weird and problematic, regressive, gendering. It's super messy.
I think it might relate to people's feelings of dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
I saw something this morning. It was, I believe, some Canadian data, and it looked at happiness among people over 60 and under 60. And it was a longitudinal graph from, I think the starting point was around 2000.
Okay.
Right. So by longitudinal, sorry, I should say, I don't mean it was the same people, but, like, they asked every 2 or 3 years, people 60.
Yeah.
And what they found was that back in like 2000, they were about the same, roughly, levels of happiness. And then we've seen a really big shift where 60 plus are getting happier, and the under 60 getting less happy. So I think that's also a factor in this is you say, okay, well, I'm a 20 or 30 something year old man, and doing what my dad and grandfather did isn't sufficient anymore. It's not cutting it.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could say the same for women as well, right? Who might be into the trad wife scene. They're like, well, I'm not deriving enjoyment or pleasure from my place in society or how I'm living my life. Yeah. Maybe something different will bring me happiness. So I think that people are ripe, I guess, for hearing these ideas. And, right, there's obviously something very, I don't know, satisfying in simplicity, right? Like the whole trad wife lifestyle is simplicity. Right. We're seeing Little House on the Prairie is making a comeback, right? All of these, like, simple times, family values things in a world where there's a lot of change. I can understand why safety and stability is appealing to people.
Well, and also, like, the kind of satisfaction of just creating a scapegoat for all these things. Like, one of the things about that documentary that really got me was that, you hear these young men voice, like, legitimate issues, like feeling disenfranchised and, issues with, like, all of these kinds of, like, much bigger worldly problems, but instead of naming, like, capitalism and, like, patriarchy, and they go, and it's women's fault. And you're like, no, you were so close. And yet there's this shift to blame women instead of blaming these kind of systemic structural things that impact all of us, right? That we're all kind of reeling from.
Yeah, it's like they're so close.
They're so close.
I guess that's maybe like a point of optimism, right? Is like they're close, and in fairness, a lot of the movements we've seen, like anti-capitalism or, like more control of that, they've never targeted white men. Like that's never been their demographic to pull in. And you hear things like patriarchy, toxic masculinity, those terms can, make people defensive.
Yeah.
Right? And they're like, this isn't a space for me. And they might not necessarily recognize masculinity as toxic, or they might just take personal affront to it because they uphold some of those standards. Yeah, I wonder if some of it is they don't recognize perhaps the bigger issues or forces that have resulted in their disenfranchisement
Right.
because it's never been framed as something for them.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Because as you say, when we talk about patriarchy, the simplified version is that like, well, it's impacting women, right? And so if you look at, men who are maybe particularly, like you talk about attachment styles, who are already maybe feeling somewhat insecure, or they don't see that discourse as relating to them as also impacting them in a negative way, right? And so the defense mechanisms come up, and I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and there was a few months ago in the UK, they announced that they are going to have some sort of, and they're vague about this, mandatory anti-misogyny courses for boys that teachers personally flag
Oh wow.
as. So there's a whole host of potential issues there of them being singled out. You're already potentially singling out people who might already be disenfranchised and not trusting of these social systems, because that's part of the sort of movement, right? Is that you can't trust state broadcasters, the education system, or
Right.
the government, whatever. And they have this giant government document outlining it's all part of their violence against women and girls strategy. A lot of it's focused on like sex ed and some really positive stuff there, which is great. And they launched their own separate men's health strategy, but they've routinely looped in one of the benefits of focusing on men's health is that it will reduce violence against women and girls, which is true and fair. But if that's one of your major selling features, you're kind of like, okay, well, isn't focusing on men's health valid in and of itself?
Yeah. Right.
It's great that, yes, you're right. If they're doing well, it probably will result in less violence. That's great. That's a great offshoot or like a downstream benefit, but that shouldn't be basically like the framing of like, well, that's why we're doing it, right? It's like, okay, well, again, you're kind of telling them you don't care.
Yeah. Right. So people who are already feeling perhaps like I mean, white men are not marginalized, but white men who are feeling on the periphery, to then frame in that way still doesn't center them, right? It's centering other people. And so it's important, if I understand you correctly, it's important how we frame these kinds of interventions and preventions.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, I think people are really close on a lot of these issues, but it's never been targeted towards certain groups or framed in that way. So then they turn their attention to something else, and yes, they'll blame women, or in that documentary they would blame like the Jews and stuff, like completely kind of random stuff, when it's like, yeah, you're so close. But I also think too, like something like capitalism is sort of set up and sold to people in a masculine way. You work hard, you're a man, and you'll make money for your family. And if you don't, it's because you're not working hard enough, and da 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 da. So to be willing to kind of reject that and say, actually, there's some problems with this economic system, requires you then to start combating a little bit of what you understand or feel about masculinity.
And your own
Or,
privilege.
yeah, and there's, I think too, right? You see any criticism of capitalism, especially coming out of the States, it's like, okay, well, then are you a communist, right? So like
Right.
those kind of like black and white thinking, it's like, no, you can argue with the system and say that it's leaving certain people behind or it's causing X, Y, and Z social issues without saying we need to necessarily completely shift our economic
Right.
system or something
Right.
like that. People can have opinions on varying degrees of that spectrum.
Mhm. That's super interesting. To shift gears a little bit, I want to talk about the kind of risks associated with youth. Young people are kind of getting their information about sex. So, like, internet pornography has become a place where many young people learn about sexual pleasure. Can you talk about the risks associated with using pornography as like a kind of primary source for sex information?
Yeah, so there was some really interesting work out of, I mean, it was Canadians, but it was out of Quebec on where people are getting their source of sex information. And what I really liked about this study was that traditionally I've seen this framed as like a single item question. Where do you get your information about sex? Well, there's lots of things about sex. There's lots of components to it. And what one might talk about with their friends is very different from what you learn in school, right? I think we all generally recognize that, but yet the research was not really picking up on that. So this Canadian research by Charest and colleagues, and I probably butchered their French name, but forgive me. They looked at it from like 10 or 12 different angles and found exactly what you would expect. Things about contraceptions, diseases, all the bad, negative things. That's what people are getting from their parents and schools and doctors versus what intimacy looks like, how to achieve orgasm, performance, pleasing one's partner, etc. Those things, kind of the mechanics of it and the more fun stuff they're getting from their friends and their intimate partners. And that was basically same for men and women, same for heterosexual people, same for LGBTQ plus people. Pretty similar trends. Again, not surprising. The only thing that was different was for heterosexual men, porn was up there as a source of this information, whereas it wasn't for anybody else. And that kind of led to one of my incel research as well is, well, incels don't have those former partners to rely on, and they identify as people who generally have very few to no friends. So where are they getting that information? And of course, the problem with that is that sex and pornography is transactional. It's outcome focused. It's not generally emphasizing emotional intimacy or closeness. It doesn't necessarily depict things in the way they actually happen. And obviously the proportion, I guess, of sex acts are going to be different, right? There's going to be some very extreme pornography out there. Are there going to be people who in real life are into that? Absolutely, but it's probably not a proportionate range, right? So you might be going in assuming that people are really into X, Y, and Z, and actually maybe that's quite rare. But I also think in the case of someone like incels who have little to no sexual experience, if they're going into that saying, "Oh no, like future partners are going to expect this of me," right? It can be quite terrifying, right? So there are, I think, a lot of problems with that being the only source, or not recognizing that like there's an artificialness to this here. These are actors in the same way that a Hallmark movie is not generally reflective of like real people's romances and like how they meet, right? It is designed for a certain demographic and a certain group, right? There's lots of talk about the male gaze. And yeah, it's all outcome focused, and right, there's no discussion of consent or any of those things. So it sets a weird standard, I think, for people.
There's been this real uptick in conversations about like the harms of social media and the internet on children and youth. I'm thinking of another psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who's kind of like led this kind of discussion. And it's led most recently to some countries banning social media use for children under 16. Canada is currently considering this. And, these decisions are based in evidence-based research. But we also know, and I'm thinking of our very own Katie Hamill, communications officer extraordinaire and PhD candidate at UMB.
I heard she's very smart.
She's very smart. Her research has shown that these same platforms, that these social media platforms can also be sites of knowledge and community, particularly for marginalized queer youth who don't receive this kind of queer-centered sex education in schools. And yeah, just thinking about the potential drawbacks of kind of banning these platforms, although, of course, with every ban, there's always, people who won't follow them. But I'm just curious to know your thoughts on these conversations, on these kind of national conversations about the harms of social media, because it is kind of connected to this social and mental health it's certainly connected to a kind of, the isolation that you spoke about among incels. And then also like the concerns are around kind of problematic understandings of sex and pleasure that kind of comes from the internet. So I don't even know where my question was in that, but maybe maybe you heard it.
Yeah, I actually got Jonathan's book for my birthday like last month. I haven't had a chance to crack it open yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. And it's interesting because, yeah, I was familiar with him and his work and his sort of crusade. And he recently posted that he felt he missed the biggest part because he's focused on social media, mental health, depression, anxiety, social comparison, body image issues. But he feels the most important thing is actually the impact it has on your attention.
Yeah.
And, as someone who's been teaching university for several years now, yeah, I can totally see that in my own experience and the experience of colleagues. So there's just so many areas in which it's infiltrated. And I'm really glad to see Canada considering this. I was worried that Australia would be alone and they would do it, run some studies, and in 10, 15 years find, wow, it made a huge difference. And then we would just start doing it and we'd be so far behind. And, I recognize that does leave some people behind. I think it would be easier to find ways to be more inclusive of those people than to simply continue with the status quo, which serves fewer people than it disserves, I guess, if that's a word. And, even thinking about the original incel communities back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were individuals who were maybe a little bit reclusive, and they found each other online and they felt a lot of solace of being like, wow, I thought I was the only person who to be 25 or 30 or 35 and to have been trying, but never being able to have a romantic or sexual relationship. It can be, and that's even something that incels that I've spoken to have experienced. They said, wow, I'm not a freak. There are other people like me. That makes me feel so much better. It makes me feel safer. I feel slightly less ashamed of who I am as a person. And I can maybe learn from some of these other people and we can reflect on things, or I can learn from reading about, their experiences or something like that. So it would suck to lose that, but it does that. Do those communities have to be social media necessarily, right? They were able to do it on an online forum, which was not, I guess, technically social media, although I guess we didn't recognize it as social media at the time. So there's probably a gray area there are going to be forums out there that aren't Facebook or Twitter or Reddit or whatever that might still allow for that sense of community and might be better moderated, because that was one of the big things about the early incel communities is that, first off, they were for any gender and they were heavily moderated. There wasn't space for, anything misogynistic or antagonistic. Whereas a lot of the spaces that exist now can be infiltrated. There might not be moderation or space to moderate a large volume of something if something were to happen. So I think it's promising that might go through. They just need to be cognizant of who's going to be more negatively impacted by that. Yeah. And I think everyone's going to be shell-shocked if it does happen for the first little while, because it's something we're all used to. And I mean, I'm an adult. I'm fully, accepting that, I check my phone way too often. I spend too much time on social media. It would be better to ban it for everybody. I don't know. There's part of your life that you'll get back as the result of that. And it will result in a shift, but it's not a shift that we can't accommodate. It's not something we've really known for that long. I get younger generations, they have grown up with it. It is all they know. But as a society, most people have spent the majority of their lives without social media. So we can adjust and adapt. And I think too, you think about the amount of time you hear about kids spending on social media. Well, the result of that is there's no time for them to go out and play with the neighborhood kids, go to the community center, play sports, etc., and form in-person relationships with other people.
One of the things I was surprised to learn in this conversation is just how far back incels go. You were saying the early 2000s, even the late 90s. So MMFC, the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre, along with 4 other research centres, came to be after the Montreal Massacre, right, in 1989. And, this is maybe not a very good question for a historian to ask, but I'm wondering, do you think Marc Le Pen would have been considered an incel if we had that language in 1989? This is counterfactual history. Don't do this.
Yeah. So I'm part of an international research group on incels where we meet once a month, and there's a huge divide among us. I'm not a clinician. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And there's a divide between the clinicians and non-clinicians on whether you would be comfortable diagnosing someone or identifying someone as an incel. And the clinicians are all like, yeah, if they met
right.
X, Y, and Z criteria, these abstract criteria, yeah, I would do it. And myself and some of the other more research focused individuals are like, no.
Yeah.
We, there's there's too much there. I mean, it's tough too because you can be involuntarily celibate. At what point do you start saying I'm an incel, or even at what point do you say I'm an involuntary celibate? How long of a period do you have to go through
Right.
to start kind of describing yourself in that way? So yeah, I don't know.
Mhm.
Even if I had more information on him, I would be reluctant to describe him as such, and I don't know, I guess, what utility it would have
I appreciate
to do
your
it.
answer. I really do. I think it's the right answer. I think it's why is it useful, right? To look back with the knowledge and the terminology we have now and place it on someone outside of the historical context.
Especially, I guess, where it's not like the current incel rhetoric was happening in those circles back then, right?
Yeah.
In the term was devised by a woman
Hmm.
who hosted a website, and again, it was a fairly pro-social network where that kind of stuff was discouraged. And it was more about building each other up. You're not alone. We're here to talk and we're here to vent. Kind of those things that they were, that even modern day incels are looking for. I want to be able to just have someone not be super dismissive of what I'm experiencing, or even giving platitudes, or hey buddy, it'll be okay, your time will come. And if someone's 18 and they've struck out romantically at that point, yeah, maybe you can be like, it'll get better, maybe college will be good for you, whatever, because sure, they don't have that much life experience, and certainly adolescence can be a tough time for some people. If they're reaching a point when they're like 30 and you're like, just give it one more year, that's, at that point, that's just kind of almost insulting to some of the incels, because they're like, it's not magically going to get better in a year. This is not, I'm in the wrong circumstance, or I'm not getting out,
Is someone from disability studies, disability history, one of the most interesting things I learned from your research is that many incels identify as being autistic, even though the percentage of them who are actually diagnosed is quite low. So they're kind of like self-identifying as autistic to kind of, in some ways, justify their social rejection. I'm so curious if there's been like a response from, from autistic people, or if I can say the autistic communities, about how incels are kind of leveraging this label to kind of explain their behaviors.
Yeah, so that's a really contentious one among some autism researchers, I should say. So the person who leads this international research group, she is an autism researcher, and she's fully on board with being like, no, we need to be acknowledging that there's a disproportionate amount of autism, both formal and informal diagnoses among incels. That's just the way it is. But there's been reluctance of some to associate autism with being an incel, right? Even though it's still a pretty small proportion of people with autism, and obviously autism is a spectrum. I wouldn't say so much that incels seem to be positioning themselves as I'm autistic, ergo that justifies my behaviors. I think for a lot of them, it's contributed to a lot of the social issues that I've had.
Hmm.
And, we know that kids with developmental disabilities or kids who are even different, even if they don't have a formal diagnosis, kids that are different and stand out in school, they do tend to be bullied. They do tend to be excluded. Um, and I don't think we should be discounting that. Something that I've talked about before is if they feel, again, it can be difficult to get formal diagnosis. There's lots of barriers to that. If they feel that they have autism to some extent, right, it's probably because they identify with some of the hallmarks of it. One of them being, of course, some social skills deficits. Well, like any kid or any adult, a lot of those deficits just mean you might need some more practice. But if you're being excluded, you're getting less practice to already deal with that deficit, right? It's sort of like if you have a fine motor skill deficit, and as a result, you're picked last for like sports teams and gym, and you don't get to handle the ball as much, then you get less opportunity to work on that and bring yourself back up to speed. So I think it's more a case of recognizing the importance of how some of these issues that they're facing, whether they're just socially awkward individuals or maybe that's the result of a diagnosis or a mental health condition. If we don't do anything about it, we can see how that can manifest and get worse and put them in a position. There's also some discussions about a lot of incel forums not necessarily super open to debate back and forth, viewing the world very rigidly, black and white thinking, an unwillingness to alter their perspective also can be hallmarks of autism. So there's certainly some threads there. And I think understanding that and acknowledging that might actually be really helpful because, right, there's a lot more research on people with autism, and there's a lot more clinical experience in working with that and working with someone with autism to maybe challenge some really rigidly held beliefs that might be really helpful with incels, even if they don't meet that formal diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So there's potentially a lot to be gained there. And I think that it can be done in a way that doesn't taint individuals with autism as being like, well, I hear that's higher among incels, so ergo, are you this?
Yeah. What do you wish people knew about incels? Like, what do you wish that you could kind of shed light on that might change people's understanding or perspective on incels?
I think I just really encourage people to, when they think about incels, whether it's hearing about them in the news, whether it's approaching it as a researcher, as a clinician, or anything like that, to do your best to stay open-minded about who they are and what their experience is, because what we know is that there is a lot of heterogeneity among incels. There's not a uniformity in terms of their belief in the black pill or any other type of ideology. There's a lot of variation in there. There's a lot of people who are reluctant to use the incel label because they don't feel that they meet, I guess, the stereotype of that. And even in my own research, when I'm recruiting, they'll say, well, I'm an incel, but I'm not that kind of incel. Right. Do I still count? And my view with, of course, my definition is that, yes, if you're calling yourself that, that is fine. You are eligible. Mm-hmm. So keeping that in mind, because incels have told me that they're now reluctant to disclose their sort of self-diagnosis as incels, or to even discuss relational problems with people because now they're being feared of being labeled and treated differently as a result. And that really is to no one's benefit. Mm-hmm. Something that's interesting too, that, because like I'm not a clinician, but I was talking to a colleague, she's a clinical PhD student at UBC, and she must be doing some sort of placement in like a healthy relationships place. And she's been having some incel clients, and her experience has been they fall, and it kind of aligns with what I've found as well, but it's interesting to see someone completely independent from a very different context say they're falling into two categories. You're getting one, which is the angry misogynist, very mad at the world, very mad at women and feminism, and are kind of this stereotype And then the other are the individuals who I've more described where there's some attachment issues, there's a lot of self-esteem issues, they're anxious, they're really not very happy with themselves, they've internalized a lot, they're self-deprecating. So there seem to be two camps, and we don't know the proportion of which is more prominent or anything like that. But again, it really goes to show that this is not necessarily a group where it's fair to paint with a single brush. There's a spectrum of people within inceldom, and we just need to be more cognizant of that.
Dr. Sparks, this has been such a great conversation. For me personally, I love reading psychology books. And, when I was reading your work and you were talking about attachment and all this stuff, I was really excited to kind of learn from you and kind of nerd out in the realm of psychology. So I appreciate everything that you've shared, the compassion and, nuanced research that you bring to this topic. I'm curious to know two things. Where do you think this research needs to move next? What do you foresee the field kind of moving toward? And also, what's next for you personally as a researcher?
I think researchers need to do a better job engaging with incels directly. Because the research field is so oversaturated, I would say, with incel forum research, and a lot of that is based on subreddits that no longer exist that are now 5, 6, 7 years old. So those can't necessarily keep up with some newer trends or things that are happening. So I think researchers need to also do a better job of establishing themselves within cells and positioning themselves as not being there to necessarily harm them, and establishing some sort of rapport to better understand those individual experiences and to better capture and understand what's going on, what can we do to make life better for those individuals, and in a pro-social way.
Right.
There's a model. So I'm a person with a forensic psych background, and one of the models that was developed primarily with sex offenders, it's out of Australia, I believe. It's called the Good Lives model. And the whole idea behind it is that people engage in crime, in acts of violence, when healthy pro-social ways of living a good life, quote unquote, is blocked from them. And that can be a good life across, I think there's 12 domains, and it can be related to personal relationships, it can be related to personal autonomy, it can be related to work, it can be related to spirituality, any of those things. And the idea is, when you're working with a client, you should figure out what are the areas that are important to them, and how can you help them achieve those in a healthy pro-social way. Idea being that, among other things, substance use treatment, et cetera, will help them live a more meaningful life, not engage in crime again. And I think something like that would be really helpful for incels. A number of them have told me that, they do have other ambitions outside of relationships, some of whom even said that they want to move away from really desiring a relationship because they realize it's not healthy for them to keep kind of fixate on this. And they feel that they could get enjoyment out of other things and mastery of other things. So figuring out what those things are, because the clinical relevance there is huge, right? If you have an incel client and you're kind of going in with the assumption, okay, well, they're going to want to get better so they can get a girlfriend or get laid or whatever it is, you might be missing something where they say, and if they don't come out and explicitly state it, maybe they really want to be the best at, whatever their profession is, or they really want to be a good older brother, or they've got a niece or a nephew and they want to be a better role model for them because maybe they didn't feel that, they had that growing up. So there's lots of areas where they could establish a meaningful life that does not contingent upon a romantic or sexual relationship. So I would like to see the research go there. I've been doing some femcel research, so focusing on women who are involuntarily celibate, And where I kind of want to go with it next is, and it was one of the things that we picked up with our first study, was there's a fear of relationships. There's a fear of sexual relationships. And we want to dive a little bit more deeply into that and what that means, what that looks like for femcells, for incels, and then maybe for people who don't belong to either of those groups. What does that look like? Is that the same? Is that different? What is there that's overlapping? Because if those people are to find themselves in relationships, they're going to need to be able to overcome these things. And we as researchers and others as clinicians are going to need to know how they can work through this with this population.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's
super fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been awesome to be in conversation with you.
And you as well. Thanks for having me.